Great. So off we go. If I can actually get this to work. There we go. Okay, so thank you very, very much for inviting me to this. I was just saying earlier on that I had so looking forward to actually coming live and discussing these ideas, all the ideas around kind of active learning with the people there. Because I think that's where, really fruitful interactions happen over the kind of coffee break and lunch and so forth. When you kind of dare to go up to the speaker and say, that point you made, I don't quite agree with, I don't quite understand it. We can't have that, but I'm very happy for people to email me afterwards as well if they want to kind of address or take up any of the points I make. Active learning is really at the heart of a lot of the research that I do. And unfortunately, I'm guilty of not having sent my title in time. And so someone using Bayesian, a priori inference guessed at what I might be talking about. And on the program, I'm shown as talking about, visual haptic cues and motor development. And so, this raised a lot of questions for me because I do some work on motor development insofar as I work with infants, and motor development is a huge constraint on how infants can interact with the world and how they learn from the world and so forth. But there are lots of other people out there who've done it way better than me. Thalen, Lockman, Campos von Hofsten are the few that jumped into my mind. So why might I be here? I did think, well, a few years ago, I put together a book with some colleagues of mine called Neuroconstructivism, which fundamentally had, so let me just get rid of the window of people. There we are. Which had kind of active learning at its heart. So neuroconstructivism was looking at how learning or adaptation occurs at different levels of representation, and how what the consistent themes across that were. And the key idea was that of interactive context dependence in development. So whether you look at the cellular level, the function of the individual neurons, how that develops, or at the level of functional brain systems, at the level of the body or social entity, the child, we find that the function is tuned or created by interactions with the context, with the other agents, the other cells, the other functional systems, the other individuals around them. And so, of course, active learning, is a critical part of that. So there's active learning at all levels. So that's great, but that's a framework, and that's a little bit old now. So I tried to think about, well, what could I be contributing to this? And I thought, well, maybe there's an opportunity to fill a gap, because I've done some work recently on kind of the multisensory environments, and how children combine and use cues in learning contexts in multisensory environments. And I think that's something that's often ignored. I mean, I've heard some fantastic talks, through today in particular. And although the stimuli that are being presented, the tasks that are being presented to the children are of a multisensory nature, we tend to ignore that fact and ignore the idea that maybe the children are exploring the different modalities in different ways. That's one thing. The other thing is that in terms of computational models of curiosity and of active learning, we talk about things such as kind of optimal information seeking or optimal information gain, strategies that are going to maximize something or another. And it's very possible that young children are not actually able to do this optimization. I know that we've seen some examples where they can, but what I want to do is actually present to you also some examples where, at least in the sensory world, sensory motor world, young children are really not doing some kind of optimal use of the information that's available to them. Or maybe they are. They're just not doing it in the way that adults think is optimal. And I think that's a caveat that we need to keep in mind when we're thinking about all these optimization type algorithms. So, in fact, I'm changing my title. This is a title I emailed at the last minute, which was just mentioned at the beginning, which is Growing Up in a Multisensory World, Active Learning with Multisensory Information. Now, this work will draw on a body of work. Sorry, this talk will draw on a body of work that I've done with some great colleagues of mine, and so I think I really need to put them up to show that their contribution is great, as big, if not greater, than mine. So the kind of sensory integration stuff I'm going to talk about is work done by Marco Nardini, now at Durham, and the multiple cue learning or learning within multiple sensory cue work is work I've done with Natasha Kirkham, among others, who's at Birkbeck as well. So let's get started. Oh yeah, so there'll kind of be two parts. I'll focus first on the cue integration and explore how optimal kids really are. And then in terms of using information, and then I'll move on to the kind of a second part, to the learning things. Okay, so I'm being really distracted by these menu bars all over my screen, which I'm now going to attempt to move so that they don't harm things. All right, so let's start with combining or using perceptual, multiple perceptual cues. As we've said, we live in a multisensory world, and you know, to use that information effectively, we need to know how to combine, how and when to combine sources of information that are coming in at the same time through different sensory modalities. So, for example, when this child is, you know, thinking about crossing the street, he needs to use visual information. Is there a car coming? But also perhaps auditory information. Does it sound like there's a car coming? And the relative weighting of those may depend on whether it's daytime, nighttime. You know, is he wearing a hat or glasses? Is it foggy, and so forth? So you have to be able to adaptively kind of balance these different cues. And it turns out that according to a number of researchers, adults are able to do what's called Bayes optimal weighting of these cues, to find some kind of optimal weighting of these cues. And we're going to ask how and when children do, and how this is impacted on by their need to act on the world. After all, perception, you know, was not evolved simply for us to have a kind of passive representation of the world. Perception was evolved in order to guide action. And I think we're going to see this happening even more saliently early in development. Oops, wrong button. There we go. All right, so very, very brief summary of Bayes cue integration. You don't need to know too many details, but the bottom line is, if you want to identify the location, for example, in space of a target, you're trying to hammer a nail onto a wall, you can use different sources of information. You can use vision, which is pretty accurate, so it has no variant, very low variance, as described by the red curve. Or you could also use your proprioceptive information about, you know, where the hand holding the nail is in space, you know, and that has much more variance because you're less accurate. But both nevertheless contribute to your ability to detect the location of the nail. So if you've ever tried, you know, hammering a nail without holding it, you realize it's a lot harder than if you're actually holding it. So you're making use of that proprioceptive information. Now, if you've tried hammering a nail with your eyes closed while holding it, you've probably lost 2 fingers already, because vision is actually really important for this. But nevertheless, by combining perceptual and proprioception, combining the 2 cues, you can get an estimate which is better than the best cue. So the combined in purple estimate is better than the best, which was vision. So this is what Bayesian optimal cue integration is. And adults do this in a lot of different domains. And there's a little bit of prior work with children from 2008. 2 papers were published in Current Biology simultaneously in the same issue, showing that kids didn't really do this kind of optimal sensory cue integration in a range of different domains until about 8 years of age. So Marco Nardini showed that they didn't integrate different kind of spatial cues, landmark and self-motion cues, to determine their location. And Monica Gori reported some work showing that children didn't integrate haptic and visual information appropriately or optimally according to the Bayes optimal framework in order to determine the relative size of something. So there's some evidence that you know, from the age of 8, before the age of 8, children are not actually being optimal in their use of the information that's available to make a decision, at least a sensory decision. And here I'm going to talk briefly about 2 different studies we did, which were exploring the kind of optimal integration of this sensory information. In the first case, within a single modality, so within vision, and in the second case, across 2 different modalities of touch, proprioception, and vision. Now, I'm going to go through this fairly quickly because the learning part is the more important part. And what I want to be focusing on here is the idea of not the psychophysics, which, you know, in some talks I focus more on the psychophysics, but the idea that optimal processing or managing of cues of information, optimal response to information may mean something different in early development than it does in adulthood. And there's a slight risk that we are penalizing the children, handicapping them by comparing them to optimal models that are based on adult optimization goals. Okay, so the first one is based on some work that came out now a few years ago in PNAS, and that was looking at the combination of two different depth perception cues. So you may know there's binocular cues, given by the relative angle of the eyes when fixating on a particular point, but there are also a bunch of monocular cues where you need only one eye, and they include things like texture gradients, here, natural texture gradients. Both of these can be used to establish what the kind of slant is, the depth is in a particular image. And what we did was get children, get children to play a game in which they had to make a judgment as to which road they were looking at moved up the highest. So which was the most difficult, the highest to move up, to climb up. And of course, we tested they understood this. And on what you can see here is the little boy, who's actually the son of a friend of mine, wearing some 3D goggles so that we can use texture binocular disparity with a regular screen. And there's a game, there's two paths, and there are two animals. There's a dinosaur here and a lion. And they simply have to respond by choosing which one's going to have a harder time climbing, and they get stickers as rewards. As you all know, because you're developmentalist, stickers will make kids go crazy, and they will, do your task for a very long time. The other thing that makes kids go crazy and do your task, which is particularly important in psychophysics, where you need hundreds of trials, is to use new technologies. If you embed things within video games or 3D video games, my gosh, they'll spend hours doing your really boring discrimination tasks. That's just a secret. So we're asking here, when are children able to combine the texture gradient cue and the binocular disparity cue to make optimal judgments about slant? And we're also going to ask how flexible they are in adapting and adjusting their use of information in these types of problems. So very quick kind of description of the paradigm. They are asked to make these decisions in 3 different contexts. So in a context in which the slopes are defined by, on the left, for example, well, let's look at the middle. In the middle, defined by a texture gradient. And so you're asked, well, which one is standing out most? And it's the one on the right. Either or one in which the information is determined only by disparity information. Of course, you're not wearing 3D glasses at the moment, so you can't see the difference, but it would be the one on the right again, or again, when they've got both cues together. And the, Bayes optimal integration framework, which suggests that their performance when they have both cues should be better than the best cue, right? So both is better than either one of them. Okay, so we also asked, as I said, how much they change their use of the information, their optimal use of information, given a particular context. Now, it turns out that in a low slant context, so when the slopes are very high or small relative to vertical, texture disparity is not very informative. So you might want, in that case, to weight the information coming from binocular disparity more. In contrast, when the slope is flat, there's a high slant, texture disparity becomes the more important cue, or the most predictive cue. So in that case, you would, on those trials, you might expect the child to, weight slant information more if they were kind of optimizing the use of information available for them. I'm going to skip that. And very briefly, what happens here? What we are looking at is there are discrimination thresholds, and without going into too much detail, if we look at the right, that the key, there are 3 columns here, which is their performance in the different conditions. DT is both cues, T is texture only, D is disparity only. What we find is that adults perform better with both cues than the best other cue, which is disparity. So that's the marker of Bayes optimal integration. And the yellow dot is the ideal observer prediction. So in fact, they're performing exactly as the Bayes model would predict. 12-year-olds are doing the same thing, but 10-year-olds and so on do not perform better with both cues. In fact, they, the 10-year-olds are performing the same as the texture, and something weird is happening in the 8-year-olds. They're not performing well with anything at all. So it kind of replicates the finding that this kind of optimal use of information for making a decision isn't really, at least in the perceptual domain, visual domain, isn't really present until about 12 years of age. What we can do is look at the weighting of the cues. And remember, in a high slant cue, the texture information is more predictive. So you'd expect a higher texture weighting in the high slant. So what we've got plotted here is the weighting to texture. And if we look again under the adult column, we see that the adults indeed put more weight on the texture information in a high slant than a low slant. So they're dynamically adjusting their use of information, as are the 12-year-olds and the 10-year-olds, whereas the non-optimally integrating 8-year-olds and below are not doing that. In fact, those of you that are really keen developmental psychologists will note that something strange is happening, marked by the red star, that the 6-year-olds are actually going in the opposite direction. So they're underweighting the texture cue in the context where it is actually more informative. So who knows why? If anybody has an idea, they can tell me, email me afterwards, except that 6-year-olds, little children sometimes do some very strange things. Anyway, we are following that up. Okay, so the children are not combining the cues optimally. Now, what happens in the adults is that when they combine these cues optimally, these information cues optimally, they fuse them into a single information stream. So the sensory information, they have a single signal of what the depth or the inclination of the stimulus is. Okay, so the information has been integrated and fused into a single stream. And one would expect that if younger children were not actually combining these things, according to the Bayes optimal thing, then they're probably not fusing the sensory information into a single stream as adults do. And that means that they might be able to retrieve the individual streams of information in a way that adults cannot retrieve the individual streams of information. So we tested this with some 6-year-olds and adults using a very similar task. Again, you have the binocular disparity glasses and the texture, and the kids are just making same difference judgments. And they've got a standard, say, on the left, and then on the right is the comparison, and they have to say same difference, and the one on the right, okay, same difference, okay? And there are 6 different conditions. There's the 3 we saw before, where they had both consistent texture and disparity cues, only disparity, only texture. That's what we saw before. And there are 2, there are 2 other conditions, but the most important condition is the one in which we now have the texture and the disparity cues going in opposite directions. So for an adult, if they're fusing these into a single average, that will now look like a plane which is in the middle, which is basically the same as the standard. So they won't be able to tell the difference. They will say same all the time in these kinds of conditions. In contrast, if the children are not fusing the cues, they can then rely on one of them, maybe the disparity cue or maybe the texture cue, who knows, to realize that this stimulus is different from the standard on the left. So we'd expect that the children's performance would be better in this T plus D minus, when there's conflicting cues, than the adults. And again, not to go on all the detail, that's what we find. If we look at the adults first, this is their detection rates, the D prime measure. The first 3 columns are exactly what we saw before. When they have both texture and disparity information, the adults are better than either texture or disparity. But importantly, if you go to the last column, when texture and disparity are in opposite directions, their detection rate is terrible because they fused it into a single average, which is the same as the standard. So they can't tell, they're guessing as to which one is, whether the same or not. In contrast, children, the 6-year-olds here don't show optimal cue integration because T plus D plus is no better than T plus, right? That's what we saw before. But interestingly, they're better than chance at detecting the right, making a same difference judgment correctly when the cues are conflicting. So this again supports, this is evidence to support that they haven't fused these sensory cues together. Okay, so again, just to summarize this, showing the, as in experiment 1, children benefit from combining the cues, but they don't suffer from having fused them together. Okay, so in some ways, 6-year-olds make discriminations that adults cannot. So why would this be the case? Why would you not want to fuse information, lock in information? Well, one possible reason is that it's useful if your cues are not, your sensory cues are not really well calibrated against each other. Okay, if the relationship between, say, vision and proprioception in space is not well established, then you don't want to lock it in because it might be wrong. Okay, and that's particularly true if you have a body that's growing. So let's not forget that children aren't just growing mentally, of course, they're growing in their physical size. So the size of the head, particularly in the first 2 or 3 years of life, the size of the head is growing and the distance between the eyes is increasing. Okay, and if the distance in the eyes increases, the disparity signal means something different. So you don't want to lock anything in too early. You need to wait till the body size has kind of stabilized before you start locking things in. Okay, so they're not optimizing cue integration, they're not fusing cues in, together, but what are they doing? I mean, is it possible that the children are still optimizing the information, but optimizing it for a different goal? And that by looking at it from an adult perspective, we are kind of misassessing what their abilities are. Maybe they're optimizing for speed or reward rather than accuracy, okay? And it's very possible that, in fact, children, we were thinking about that children might be optimizing their kind of sensory information integration to optimize speed rather than accuracy, because general processing speed in children is slower than adults. So the kind of CPU is going to take a little bit longer to work through all those calculations. And if you're trying to interact with a real dynamic world, well, here are 2 pictures of things that happen when your decision-making, your sensory motor decision-making isn't keeping up with the rapidly evolving world. So failure to keep up with the rapidly evolving world can be catastrophic. So what we did is, again, another one of these tasks where now we had a speeded response task. Same different type things, but they had a reaction time pressure as well. And just to cut a long story short, what happens with the adults is you get the accuracy benefit for DT over the others that we've observed before, but no benefits in terms of reaction time. They basically go as quickly as the quickest cue. And for the 6-year-olds, there's no benefit in accuracy. They seem to be guessing or jumping between the 2 cues, whereas at least at some slants, you find that their responses are optimized for speed. So their speed of response with both cues is faster than the fastest single cue. So the children seem to be optimizing for something else, speed of response, because there are different pressures on them. And they're not fusing sensory information together because their bodies are still changing, right? So, perceptual cue integration is constrained by the need to continuously adapt to the constraints of a rapidly changing body, relatively well, and of course, to act in real time on a dynamic, rapidly evolving world. 2 constraints. And the cautionary note I want you in the context of this workshop to come away from is that what might be adult optimal is not necessarily the same as child optimal. So optimal information seeking as judged by an adult may not be optimal information seeking as judged by a child. Okay, so I see we're about 25 minutes into it. I'm going to move on to my second example, but which hopefully will be quite brief about kind of the cue integration. And I'm just talking about this one because it's across modalities, but because it involves the haptic system as well, and motor development was in my initial title. Okay, so we use our hands for active exploration, of course. They're critical for active exploration, but how do we kind of localize the position in space in order to enable us to kind of interact with the world as we wish? We could use vision, we could use proprioception. Both these cues will give us a location in space, but how do they interact? We tested this by using a task which was similar to the one we had before, in which children had to localize a target with the finger under the table here. They had to touch a location, that was marked by one of the three sticker targets here. This was an ocean. There was a shark, a fish, and an octopus, and they had to touch under the octopus, under the fish, or under the shark. Okay, but there were several conditions. In the vision condition alone, they had, they could see the top. They could see the top, but not obviously underneath the table where they were touching. In the proprioception alone, they wore little masks, so there was no eye, no visual information, and the experimenter placed their top hand, in this case the child's right hand, and positioned the finger on top of the target location, so that they only had this proprioceptive information in order to try to touch it underneath as a location, as a cue to the location, and vision proprioception. They had their eyes open and their hands placed there. Again, forget the top. We're looking at the bottom here, the bottom row, which is what their performance was in the context of both vision and proprioceptive information, VP versus V only vision, or P only proprioception only. If we look at the right on the adults are showing this optimal cue integration, that their performance with VP is better than both P and V. By the way, note that P, this is variance, so the variability of their responses. P is much less reliable. Proprioception is much less reliable than vision, as is expected. However, the 10 to 12-year-olds are not showing optimal integration. They're just basically following the same performances as vision. And the 7 to 9-year-olds are again doing optimal integration, and the 4-year-olds or 5-year-olds are not. Okay, so we've got some kind of weird, non-linear, non-monotonic developmental pattern going on here. So what we did was, for various computational modeling reasons that I won't go into, we selected basically those participants who had a reasonable amount of variability in their proprioception. So the ones that were reasonably good at localizing something under the table with their finger, so that their sigma, their variance, the variance of their proprioception response was no more than 2 times the variance of the vision. So they were no more than twice as bad. And if you take those kids that have reasonable proprioception and reasonable compared to the vision, then what we get is actually everyone in those cases is able to combine, or does combine, the kind of proprioceptive signal with information, with the visual information, in a kind of optimal way, Bayes optimal way. Okay. So what about the weighting of cues? Remember, we saw with the slants thing that children and adults, or optimal adults, were able to reweight whether they were paying attention to texture disparity, depending on the context. And again, here we have individuals. We're back to talking about all of the individuals. So not just the ones with low proprioceptive variance, but all of them. And this is looking at their weighting of visual cues. The visual cue is a function of how much worse the variance of proprioception is to vision. So basically, if you have really bad proprioception, you should be weighting your vision more, if you're like shaking all the time. And that's indeed what the adults do, not the 10 to 12-year-olds who were not optimal integrators. It's what the 7 to 8, 9-year-olds do, who are also the optimal integrators, and not the 4 to 6-year-olds. So those that are showing this optimal use of information are also optimally able to adapt their strategy in response to this information when interacting with the world. And one of the key questions is why these ages, 10 to 12 and 4 to 6, why are these ages at which this kind of weighting, instead they're adopting a kind of flat, equal weighting of vision and proprioception. And one idea we have, that we haven't tested this, is that these correspond to ages, again, of rapid physical growth. So the growth spurt from about 11 in girls, and 4 to 6, there's quite a lot of growth. And that, again, if you are growing, your limbs are growing as well, you have your proprioceptive signal is less well calibrated in space. So we have a response to physical changes in the body impacting on the kind of strategies, decision-making strategies, the perceptual motor decision-making strategies in children at those ages. And when the growth slows down or goes through a period of stability, then they shift to a different type of information use strategy, which is perhaps more optimal. Okay, so I've gone through this. Okay, so general conclusions from this part. Children do not combine sensory information in the same way as adults until relatively late. Between modality Q, optimal Q combination arrives around 8, and or at least in our studies, and within modality even as late as 12 as well. So a key conclusion to take away from this, or suggestion to take from this, is that not integrating, not combining the information optimally may convey advantages for growing bodies where sensory calibration is rapidly changing. Optimizing for speed, something that adults are not optimizing for, may actually convey an advantage for slower processors, and that the kind of perception for action, the perception is the basis for acting with the world, has very prolonged developmental profile. We have this tendency to think, oh, well, by 3, yes, in infants, perception is developing, but by 3 or 4, everything's finished. Well, no, it keeps going, subtly developing well into almost adolescence. And the key here is to understand that adult optimal is not the same as child optimal. So when we're talking about optimal information seeking or optimal information use, it may be different in children than in kids, than adults. Okay, so I'm about half an hour, a little bit over half an hour. So I'm going to shift to the learning aspects of this. So children do not combine information, different sensory modalities in the same way as adults. What about using that information to learn something relevant, like a concept or a category? So here what we're going to do is explore how children use the multisensory information that's available to them, some of it redundant, some of it not redundant, to help support their learning of concepts or categories. And I'm going to talk about learning in 2 different contexts because, just to foreshadow, it turns out that the use of multisensory information for learning depends on the type of learning, whether it's a kind of instructed learning, directed learning, or whether it's kind of incidental, more freestyle learning. They will rely on sensory cues in different ways. So there's 3 sections. We'll focus on instructed learning first. There's a short footnote on vision and touch, because I was supposed to be talking about motor, and then looking at how that contrasts with the incidental free learning contexts. So in order to assess the use of different cues, what we developed is a kind of multisensory category learning task. In all of these things, the children are playing a game, often a computer game, and they have to identify what family, what spaceship various aliens.
Where's my mask?
Where various aliens are live in, okay? And the aliens are defined by features such as stripes, legs, and so forth. And they also are associated with a sound. And I don't know if you can hear this.
Yeah.
Don't know if you can hear that or not, but it's a kind of yo. And then the other one.
Yeah.
No. So there's 2 classes. In fact, you can classify them according to the type of sounds they were making, or you can classify them according to some kind of visual features. And here we tested 3 age groups: year 1, year 3, and year 5, which is 5, 6, 7, 8, and 9, 10 in the UK. So between subject design, there are 3 conditions: audio only, in which they always had the same alien appearance but different sounds; video or visual only, in which they had all kinds of different looking aliens, but the sound was always the same; and then audio visual, where there was a unique sound and visual appearance for each individual alien, but these were actually redundant. So they both pointed to the same category, the same membership of the family. And so very quickly, the alien appeared, the child made a choice, which spaceship did it live in, and then they got feedback because the alien then went off to the actual spaceship so they could see whether they were right or wrong, and then another alien appeared and so forth. And what happened? These are, in this particular task, they had up to 60 trials to learn the category, and learning the category was getting 6 trials in a row correct. And basically what we find is that green line is the audiovisual group, blue is the audio, red is the visual. And what we find is that maybe for the 5-year-olds, there's a slight advantage of having audiovisual information rather than visual and audio only, in that it took them fewer trials to learn the category than than for the others. But in fact, for the other age groups, audio-visual was basically the same as visual. So the children were captured by the visual information in the audio-visual. And interestingly, performance when they only had to attend to the auditory was much better. So in fact, the audio-visual condition, where they had both the visual and the audio, but the visual captured, could be seen as kind of detrimental because it pulled them away from using the auditory information, which is where they were actually best at learning this task, the domain in which they were best at learning this task. So the answer about the value of multisensory information for learning in this case is not at all straightforward. Sometimes there's a benefit, sometimes there isn't. Sometimes, in fact, the multisensory information, as with the 10-year-olds, audio can actually be detrimental. So we then kind of ran a second study where I'm going to skip through it. It's basically exactly the same thing, that at the end, we provided the children with with features in which, with aliens in which they could use only visual or only auditory information. And this was to allow us to assess in the AV condition whether they had somehow combined the two sources of information to a single representation, or whether they were in fact attending to only vision or only audio information. And to cut a long story short, they were essentially whatever the children, whatever condition they were in, even in the audiovisual condition, they essentially had just paid attention to visual information. At least the younger and the older ones, no idea what's going on in the middle group. So just to go quickly through this, audiovisual context appears to have an advantage for younger kids. When you look at more closely, really what's happening is a single dimension vision is kind of coming to dominate their learning, or the way they approach this particular category learning problem. Little quick footnote, I realize I'm slightly running out of time. The quick footnote to look at this in vision and touch. I mean, is this does this generalize to other sensory modalities as well? We explore the world with touch, of course. So we had a similar sort of task with vision and touch, in which in this case, it's not a computer game, but rather an actual physical classification game. So the children were presented with these little aliens called beanies, which were beanbags stuffed with something in them and with an appearance on them. And they differed in terms of appearance. The critical dimension was the number of dots for classifying them as an A or a B type beanie bob. Inside them, there was all kind of different materials. Everyone was unique, but some of them had hard, uncompressible material like dried chickpeas, marbles, I don't know, stuff like that. The other ones had soft compressible materials like wool and paper and things like that in it. And we balanced out all kinds of things like amount of noise it made, the weight of across the families and all that sort of stuff. The task is slightly different in that the kids were presented with these one at a time and then had to categorize them. Do these aliens live over here? Do they live over there? And they were given feedback again each time. And there were three conditions: the haptic only, where the visual information was always the same, but it was the insides that was determining what family they lived in. The visual only, where the insides was always the same, so the visual information was what was predicting what family they lived in. And then the not audio-visual, but the visual haptic, where both vision and haptic information were redundant and predicting one way or the other. Just quickly, the setup was something like this, in case you're wondering how we did that. In terms of visual and haptic only information, they were presented with a little alien inside a box, and they had to put their hands in it so they couldn't see it, and they would touch and physically explore this object, this little alien, in order to decide whether it went into the rocket on the left or the rocket on the right. Visual haptic, they could look at it and touch it. Vision only, they could see it, but they weren't allowed to touch it. Same age ranges as before. And broadly, we get an analogous finding. Older kids are better than younger kids, but here we have an age by condition interaction, which is driven by the fact that the children were poorest in the younger age group anyway, in the vision only conditions. So in this case, it's not vision. The visual haptic and the haptic were the same at all age groups. So again, visual haptic was not an advantage. What they were doing in the visual haptic is when you had access to both cues, is one of the cues was capturing the children's attention and learning. In this case, it was the haptic dimension instead of the visual dimension in the previous one. Okay, so different cue is dominating, but it's still the same idea that in this multisensory world, they're just collapsing the problem into a single kind of domain, sensory domain type problem. You know, at 10 years of age, they're good on vision alone as well. Okay, so that was just a kind of caveat about visual haptic information, and it's the findings are analogous to what we found with the auditory information. These were in an instructed task where the children were told that there is a category, a family, and that they had to. The instruction was to figure out which one went where. Here we had a similar. We're asking a similar question, but we're using incidental learning task, where the category learning is happening. Is not what they're focusing on. It's not what they're meant to be doing. So why is that important? Well, in educational research, there's a lot of work looking at incidental learning in the classroom. For example, the classrooms are decorated with all kinds of educational things, letters, numbers, and so on. And the idea behind it is that although they might be engaging on a particular task, I don't know, reading a story, other information is accessible within their kind of attentional framework, and they can learn from this as well. So incidental learning is really an important part of how acquisition is believed to occur in primary schools. So this task involved, there was a primary task and then the incidental learning task. The primary task was simply a detection task, okay, what we call the multisensory attention learning task. And maybe the next slide. Oh, the year groups are exactly the same as before. So, 6-year-olds, 8-year-olds, 10-year-olds. 3 different conditions: visual only, auditory only, or audio and visual redundant information. Oops. Visual information was that defined categories was a number of dots on the frogs you can see here. And auditory, I don't know if you can hear it or not, but one croak, and I'm not going to impersonate a frog, and another croak, which is a different frog that I'm not going to impersonate. So, there was auditory information to discriminate them as well. Now, the task the children were told is they were in a detection task. So they had to push a space bar. There was a lily pad and a log, and an animal would appear in the middle. In this case, it's a pig at first, then a dog, then a frog. And they were told to push the bar only when they saw the frog. So they were there to detect frogs. So a signal detection type task. But if once a frog had appeared, whether they caught it or not, detected it or not, the frog was then carried by net to one of the 2 habitats, the left, the lily pad, or the right, the log. Okay, so again, they were getting information about which one lived in which domain, although this was incidental to the task they were involved in. They were never told at any point that there was any category learning, involved at all. Right, okay. So at the end, we, so at the end, we tested their category knowledge, surprise tested their category knowledge by showing them a frog with either vision information alone, auditory information alone, or auditory and visual information, and asked them, where do you think this frog lives? So remember, this is not what they were engaged in. It's a secondary incidental task. And in this case, now this is mean total correct on the category task. What we have is a main effect of age. Of course, older kids are better than younger kids. But we also have a main effect of condition, that all kids were better in the audiovisual condition. So on incidental learning, having redundant multisensory information, auditory and visual information, was actually supporting better learning. So they're using information, if you want to speak, seeking, acquiring information from both modalities, albeit incidentally. And then we asked, well, how long this effect lasted. So because this was all, instantaneous retesting, so we reran the experiment, another 180 kids, another same age group, same task, but this time they did the frog detection thing, the MOLT task. But this time we came back the next day, 24 hours later, to ask them to run the categorization task on it. Okay, so the incidental test was 24 hours later. And now what we find 24 hours later is their performance is not that good, but their performance is better at all age groups in the audiovisual condition rather than the visual or the auditory condition. So when it comes to retention of the information, the incidentally acquired information, multisensory redundant input was facilitative as opposed to having just one of the only one of the sensory modalities. Okay, so to start to wrap things up, what have we found here is that as early as 5 to 6 years of age, children demonstrate greater performance on incidental category learning when exposed to multisensory information as opposed to visual or auditory information. Yeah, and that's exactly what I said before. And if it also improved their retention, not just immediately, but 24 hours later as well. Okay, so lots of fast talking. What are the conclusions that we can take away from this work and its relevance to the kind of active learning workshop? First of all, in the explicit instruction task, we see no real advantage for multisensory information, except maybe at the youngest age group. That's when they're directed on the task, on what task they should be doing. In the incidental learning task, where they're paying attention to something else, but they also have the possibility of exploring and learning about other things, multisensory information there did support better learning in all age groups in the short and long term. Okay, so why might that be the case? And we had some speculation, which links into active learning, that perhaps they engage in different strategies in instructed versus incidental learning, category learning contexts. It's very possible that in the instructed task, what family do these belong to, the children engage in a unidimensional hypothesis testing, like, oh, I wonder if it's the spots, or I wonder if it's the legs on the aliens, okay, or I wonder if it's the sound. And by focusing on a single dimension in this hypothesis testing, they then filter out the information, the other information, the information from the other sensory modality. And whereas in the incidental learning, there's no filtering out with a kind of selective attention thing. They're just absorbing, or learning from both visual and auditory information. So this is similar to the Bonowitz and several other people have pointed out that actually by directing instruction, you may actually be restricting the types of hypotheses that children are will engage in trying to learn and solve a problem. So this is an example of this happening in a purely sensory domain. Okay, and so general conclusions from the whole thing. What can we take away from this? Multisensory cue combination, the use of information from different cues has a very protracted period of development. As I've said, adult optimal use of this information is not the same as child optimal use. So be careful when talking about optimal information seeking or optimal information use. The usefulness of multisensory information from different sensory streams for children in learning situations is complex and not straightforward. Sometimes it helps, sometimes it can actually hinder, as we saw with some 10-year-olds. But the multisensory information appears to be more useful in incidental learning or free learning contexts, where the child can kind of explore or is able to explore the environments more than in an instructed learning context. And in the last 2 or 3 minutes, I just want to say a few things. I want to return to the why am I here question. In fact, the information, the presentation I gave you was looking at how children kind of combine information streams optimally, and the use of multisensory information from different sensory streams during learning, and how this might differ depending on the type of learning, a kind of more free versus a directed, instructed type of environment. I do actually have a couple of projects on the go which are maybe more closely linked to active learning, as discussed by the other people in this workshop. I have a project that we're just starting up now with members of a Marie Curie ITN, the Motion Network, and which involves Bunya, Lardy, Polly, and Hunyus, at least on this project, which is looking at whether exploration strategies are the same within a modality versus across modalities. So are you going to be the same kind of explorer, the same kind of information seeker in the visual domain as in the haptic domain, for example? Or do people switch how they go about searching for information, how curious they are, if you want to use that term, depending on the modality that the information is being processed in. So this is kind of curiosity across consistency of curiosity across modalities. And then another project that we have now more or less completed and have just submitted for publication was to look at parent-child interactions and really how the role of affective touch by the parents on young babies might promote active exploration. So this is based on some work that Gliga did with her students, looking at visual exploration in babies after a kind of social touch, stroking versus a non-social touch. And social touch seemed to heighten the amount of visual exploration. Here what we're doing is taking this into a more realistic world and looking at how affective touch that might change the affective state of the child. And so we were measuring kind of hormones such as oxytocin and cortisol, as well as behavior, how these kind of calming, for example, or stroking the child by the mother may then put the child in a state where they are more likely to engage in active exploration of objects in the real world. So this is currently submitted. So if you want to invite me again next year, if this is running next year, I'll have some results on these sorts of projects as well. But for the time being, that's all I was going to say. Thank you very much for listening. And I hope this is nice and kind of complementary and useful information to what you've been hearing over the last few days. So I think I will